When Lightning Comes in a Jar by Patricia Polacco. For my beloved children, Tracy, Denise, Stephen, John, tell your children how you caught lightning in a jar. Today is my family reunion. I can hardly wait. My dad's side of the family will come soon. It's been ages since I've seen them all. Before our reunions were always at Grandma's house, but this year it's going to be at mine. I'm so anxious to see my cousins, especially Lydia and Sandy. They'll be wearing the same colors that we always wear at family reunions. They wore them at our last reunion. How I remember that day. Grandma and I stood at the front window, waiting for our relatives to come. "I can't wait to see them all," I said to her. "I know," she answered. "Will there be Jell-O like there always is?" I asked. "Yes," she answered. "And baseball and croquet like there always is?" "And bag races, too." "And will you tell stories like you always do?" "Might," Grandma said, looking at the sky, "and we might catch lightning in a jar." "Lightning in a jar?" I asked. This was new. And then my relatives started showing up at the carload, one after another. Finally, the car that I was waiting for rolled up, and my 5 cousins piled out. Sandy, Freddie, Billy, Lydia, and Carl. Sandy, Lydia, and I squealed and ran for the porch swing, just like we always did. We held hands and pushed the swing with our bare feet. We told secrets that we had kept for a whole year. And I told them about lightning in a jar. When my dad called out, "Who's going to help unload these baskets from the car?" we shouted, "We will!" and we lugged baskets full and heavy to the tables in the maple grove. "Wonder how many Jell-O salads there'll be," my cousin Freddie asked. "Gazillions, there always are," my cousin Billy answered. Sure enough, there were gazillions. They jumped and shook every time we bumped the table. They seemed alive. "Bet there'll be many meatloafs, too," my brother chimed in. And there were, as we unpacked them, zillions of meatloafs. They were all different, too. Each auntie had her own recipe, including Aunt Bertha, who made one with a hard-boiled egg in the middle. When we cut it, there was a perfect slice of egg, like a giant eye. Our aunties and Grandma flitted around the table like butterflies going from flower to flower. They perked the lettuces or rearranged the tomatoes and set slices of meatloaf so they looked perfect. When Grandma and the aunties took off their aprons, we all knew it was time to gather around the table. We all held hands, and Uncle Wyland said the blessing. Then everyone sat down and dove into the food, piling it high on the plates, some as high as haystacks. My brother Richie was sitting with some older girls that came. With our older cousins, he was acting silly. I could tell he liked one of them. Embarrassing. When we thought we couldn't eat any more, Grandma and my aunties put their aprons back on and started getting all the pies and cakes from the kitchen. There was something magical about my Grandma and her sisters this day, like they knew something they weren't telling. I did wonder how my Grandma was going to catch lightning in a jar, and every so often I'd stop her and ask her how. She'd just smile and say, "Easy. Someday you'll do it too." And as we ate, it was time for our annual baseball game, my dad and uncles against us kids. "Batter up!" my dad called out as my cousin Billy stepped up to home plate. Lucky he was on our team. He could hit anything. When he was at field, he'd leap up in the air and make impossible catches. "That kid can jump higher than a cow's back," our uncle used to say. First pitch out, Billy hit the ball so hard it clean disappeared. We thought we saw lightning as it hit the sky. Maybe lightning was on its way. Was that what Grandma was trying to catch in a jar? "I'm going to be a Detroit Tiger someday," Billy said that day. We all knew that he most certainly would. Next, it was time for croquet, the biggest game of the day, which our uncles kept interrupting with friendly quarrels about bent hoops, crooked wickets, and wanting to take reshots. We had bag races and watermelon seed spitting contests and rides on Grandpa's draft horse, too, until Grandpa waved a yardstick in the air. All of us kids dropped what we were doing and ran to the milk shed. We knew it was time to get measured. We did this every year. I liked looking at the marks of my Grandma and her sisters and brothers on the same doorway, some shorter than mine. Hard to imagine that once they were little just like me. Aunt Bertha had gone to the house and fetched the family portrait albums. The aunties showed us old brown photos and pointed. That was their father who saved souls as a circuit preacher when he wasn't farming. And look, theirs were their favorite horses. Their eyes sparkled when they showed us their wedding pictures, the aunties all married in their mother's parlor. I watched Grandma to see if she would summon the lightning from the sky. It was time for our family photo, Aunt Iva called out as she jumped up and grabbed her camera. We kids didn't like this part because it meant that any dirt on our faces would have to be scrubbed off with a hanky that our aunties had spit on, especially mine. Everyone smile, Aunt Iva sang out. After this, the kids started to chant, "Stories, stories, stories, please." Grandma and her sisters and brothers started quiet and slow. Uncle Ernst told about milking cows faster than lightning. Grandma told about how she and her sisters walked 7 miles to a one-room schoolhouse over in Lock Center, and how each of them taught in that same school. Then, as quiet as Aunt Iva started fanning herself, we knew she was getting ready. I remember the day I was driving that rig home from school when it came out, a real rattlesnake. We all looked at one another. Rattlers weren't around these parts, so we knew it was going to be good. That thing was all coiled up and shaking its tail, not rattling sounds, somewhere like a loud buzz. Bell Horse just stood there and shook. "What'd you do, Aunt Iva?" we called out. "Well, sir, I stepped up on that buggy, took my umbrella, and put it smack in the middle of the snake, all pulled up. It just wrapped around that umbrella. I knew if it struck me, I was a goner." We all leaned forward. "So I picked it up, gave that umbrella a sharp jerk, and opened that snake up into Cecil Potter's field. Then I jumped into my buggy and galloped home, like the wind." All my aunts and uncles laughed. There was a flicker of heat. Lightning sprang out over the horizon. The air didn't move. Was the magic going to happen? Aunt Ada fluttered her fan. We knew she was getting ready to top Aunt Iva's story. "Have I ever told you children about the time I took a ride in that first newfangled motor car here in this country?" "No," we kids sang out. "Well, sir, it belonged to L.D. Dunkel. My pa did not approve of him. No, never, nohow. He's a wild kid," he'd rave. "Don't never want to see you with the likes of him." Then one day I was walking home from a prayer meeting. He rolled up next to me and driving the shiniest machine I'd ever seen. Aunt Ada stopped and fanned some more. "What happened, Aunt Ada?" we begged. "Well," Aunt Ada crowed, "I climbed right into that thing. Eddie shifted that contraption, making a terrible sound, and that roadster almost leapt right out from underneath us. It went so fast my hat blew clean off. We were going almost 40 miles an hour. We raced up Moyer Road, hurtled past Evie Peters' barn, and almost flattened the Bender sisters' fruit stand, then howled down Dritz Road." We gasped. "And then we skidded to a stop in front of Pa's barn, and there he was, just a-standing there." She stopped again and fanned herself. "What'd he do, Aunt Ada? What happened?" we all pleaded. "Not a blessed thing," she answered, and laughed so hard she almost dropped her lemonade. Heat lightning flickered again, and there was a low rumble of thunder in the distance. Now I watched my grandmother, and she smiled and gave me a wink. It was her turn. "Well, sir," Grandma began, "I was but a girl out plowing, helping Pa in the fields. His team could pull all those rows straight as an arrow. When the team reared up and bolted and dragged me halfway down the field before I could free myself, I stood up there, was fierce and clatter and roar in the sky above me." We all leaned about her. "It was like thunder and fierce lightning." She stopped and sipped the lemonade. "Was it, Grandma?" we kids begged. I looked up, waiting for the lightning. "Well, sir, I couldn't believe what I was seeing above me." We crawled close to her knee. "There was a giant dragonfly with 2 sets of wings, growling and roaring and pitching and roaring and spewing foul-smelling smoke." She leaned forward. "It was the first ever flying machine in the state of Michigan." We all clapped with delight. That would have been a perfect time for the lightning to come, but it didn't. It was almost dark. I whispered to Grandma, "What about the lightning in a jar?" She adjusted her glasses and gave me a look. "Have the last rays of sun left the grass?" she asked. I looked real hard. "Yes," I said. "Then sit down, child." Aunt Bertha brought the wicker basket full of glass canning jars and put them at Grandma's feet. "Many years ago, when your aunties and uncles and I were wee children, our grandpa showed us what I'm about to show you." She leaned down and touched the grass, cupping something in her hands. She thought for a moment, and then she said, "Shadows lengthen, the day is done. Birds fly low at setting sun. Stars will rise from earth above. In these hands their light will glow. Come up, lightning, come up, stars. We'll snatch you in there's these here jars." She blew into her hands and let something go. It flew for a moment, then it landed deep in the grass. We watched and we watched, but nothing happened. Low thunder rumbled just above us. "Look!" my cousin Billy called out. A small burst of starlight puffed out to the grass. Then more and more drifted out of the carpet of lawn beneath our feet. "Fireflies!" we all called out. We grabbed the jars, and the dash was on to capture lightning and put it in a jar. Grandma gave me a knowing look and smiled. When everybody had gone home that night, Grandma and I sat on the porch swing together. We looked at the flickering jar, and even though fireflies are common in Michigan on summer nights, never had I seen so many that night. And as long as I live, I believe that somehow Grandma called them up, with her stories and her magic. That night seems so long ago, but the reunion is here again. My family is arriving now. My heart is racing. We eat scrumptious jello and meatloaf, play baseball and croquet, spit watermelon seeds, and scrawl new measurements on my milk house door jamb. We look at photo albums, and we laugh at some and cry at others. We'll remember the stories, how Grandma saw the first fly machine and Aunt Iva conquered the rattler. We'll talk about Billy and how he should have been a Detroit Tiger but gave his life for his country in a war far away. And then, when the sun is low and the shadows long, we'll all sit and fan ourselves in the shade of the maple tree. Only a new crop of children will gather at our knees. My father, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles are no longer here, so now it is we who must tell their stories and bring them back for fleeting moments. Then I will show the children the magic that my grandma showed me. I'll call the stars from beneath their feet, and as they rise up to the warm night, these children will leap as high as the cow's back to gather them up. I'll send them home with full bellies, tired bones, and flickering jars in their laps. Their hearts will be overflowing, full of lightning, put there by folks who loved them even before they were born. Grandma knew this well. She knew that some day they would tell their children all about all of us and the magic nights that we caught lightning in a jar.